The story of Noah's flood is one of the most well-known tales in the Bible, but there's a darker, more mysterious aspect to this narrative that many people overlook. Before the Great Flood came to wash the earth clean, there were giants walking among humans. These weren't just tall people. According to biblical accounts, these were massive, powerful beings whose very existence posed such a threat to humanity and God's plan that they had to be completely destroyed. But what exactly did these giants do that was so terrible? Why was drowning them in a worldwide flood the only solution? To understand this, we need to dig deep into some of the Bible's most controversial and mysterious passages. The origin of the giants, a forbidden union. The story begins in Genesis 6:1-4, one of the most puzzling passages in the entire Bible. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children with them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. This brief passage has sparked thousands of years of debate among scholars, theologians, and believers. Who were these sons of God? The most widely accepted interpretation suggests they were fallen angels, divine beings who abandoned their heavenly positions to pursue relationships with human women. The result of this forbidden union was the Nephilim, often translated as giants or fallen ones. These weren't ordinary humans. They were hybrids, part divine, part human, possessing supernatural strength, size, and abilities that made them formidable and dangerous. The Book of Enoch, while not part of the standard biblical canon, provides much more detail about this event. According to Enoch, 200 angels, led by one named Semjaza, descended to Mount Hermon and made a pact to take human wives. These angels, called Watchers, were supposed to observe humanity, not interfere with it. But they broke their divine mandate and corrupted themselves through physical relationships with humans. What made the giants so terrible? To understand why God felt compelled to destroy these beings through a global flood, we need to examine what they were actually doing on Earth. The biblical and extra-biblical sources paint a picture of creatures whose very existence threatened the future of humanity and God's plan for creation. Corruption of human DNA. The most fundamental issue was genetic corruption. The Nephilim represented a contamination of the human bloodline. God had created humans in his own image, with a specific genetic makeup and spiritual capacity. The introduction of angelic DNA into the human gene pool threatened to corrupt this divine design permanently. This wasn't just about physical changes, though the giants were indeed massive in size. It was about spiritual corruption that could be passed down through generations. If this genetic contamination spread throughout all of humanity, there would be no pure human line left through which God's promised Messiah could eventually come. Supernatural strength and violence. The giants possessed supernatural strength that they used for destructive purposes. They weren't content to live peacefully among humans. Instead, they became tyrants and oppressors, using their superior physical abilities to dominate and terrorize normal people. Genesis 6:11 tells us that the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. This violence wasn't just ordinary human conflict. It was violence on a scale and intensity that could only come from beings with supernatural capabilities. The Book of Enoch describes how these giants consumed everything in sight. They ate all the food that humans had produced, then turned to eating the humans themselves, and finally began devouring each other. They became cannibalistic monsters with appetites that couldn't be satisfied through normal means. Teaching forbidden knowledge. According to the Book of Enoch, the fallen angels didn't just corrupt humanity through their offspring, they also taught humans knowledge that was never meant for them to have. This included the arts of war and weapon-making, cosmetics and vanity, sorcery and witchcraft, astrology and divination, metallurgy and mining. While some of these might seem harmless, the text suggests that humanity wasn't ready for this knowledge and that it was given with malicious intent. The angels taught humans how to make weapons specifically to increase violence and bloodshed. They introduced practices that led people away from worshiping God and toward occult practices, creating a race of titans. The giants weren't just individually problematic. They were reproducing and creating an entire race of supernatural beings. If left unchecked, they would have completely taken over the earth. Normal humans, with their limited strength and lifespans, could never have competed with these hybrid beings. The giants lived much longer than ordinary humans and grew to enormous sizes. Some traditions suggest they reached heights of 300 feet or more. They had the intelligence of angels combined with physical bodies that could interact with the material world. This made them incredibly dangerous opponents for normal humans. Spiritual rebellion. Perhaps most importantly, the giants represented a direct rebellion against God's established order. They were living proof that divine beings could successfully rebel against heaven and establish their own kingdom on earth. Their very existence was a challenge to God's authority and a corruption of his creation. The extent of the corruption. By the time of Noah, this corruption had spread to such a degree that Genesis 6:5 tells us, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time." This wasn't just about a few bad people. It was about the complete moral and spiritual collapse of civilization. The influence of the giants and their angelic fathers had corrupted nearly everyone on earth. Only Noah and his family remained perfect in their generations, a phrase that many scholars interpret to mean they were genetically pure, uncontaminated by the Nephilim bloodline. This is why God chose Noah's family to survive the flood and restart human civilization. Why drowning? Why not another method? God could have destroyed the giants and their corruption in many ways, so why choose a worldwide flood? Several factors make this method particularly significant. Complete cleansing. Water has always been a symbol of purification and cleansing in biblical literature. The flood didn't just kill the giants. It washed the earth clean of their contamination. Every trace of their civilization, their hybrid offspring, and their influence was swept away. No escape giants with their supernatural abilities might have been able to escape other forms of destruction. They could have fled to high places, used their strength to build shelters, or even called upon their angelic fathers for help. But a worldwide flood left nowhere to hide and no way to escape. Symbolic reset. The flood represented a complete reset of creation. Just as God had originally brought the earth up out of the waters during creation, he now returned it to the waters and brought it up again, clean and purified. This was a new beginning for humanity. Judgment on the watchers. The flood wasn't just judgment on the giants, it was also judgment on the fallen angels who had started the whole mess. By destroying their offspring and the civilization they had corrupted, God was demonstrating that their rebellion had ultimately failed. The aftermath. Did the giants really all die? Interestingly, the Bible suggests that giants appeared again after the flood. Numbers 13:33 mentions the Nephilim being in the Promised Land when the Israelites arrived, and various giant individuals like Goliath appear throughout the Old Testament. This raises some challenging questions. How could there be giants after the flood if they were all supposed to have drowned? Several theories attempt to explain this. The genetic theory. Some suggest that the genetic corruption wasn't completely eliminated. Perhaps it lay dormant in some of Noah's descendants and occasionally expressed itself in later generations. The angel theory. Others propose that more fallen angels came to earth after the flood and repeated the same process, creating new giants. The survivor theory. A few scholars suggest that some giants might have survived the flood by being on boats, hiding in high places, or through other means. The metaphorical theory. Some interpret later references to giants as metaphorical, referring to people who were tall or powerful, but not supernatural hybrids. The ongoing battle. Throughout the Old Testament, we see God's people repeatedly fighting against giants and their descendants. The Philistines, Amalekites, and other groups are often described as being unusually large and fierce. David's battle with Goliath is perhaps the most famous example, but it was part of a larger pattern of conflict between normal humans and these supernatural opponents. This ongoing battle suggests that the corruption introduced before the flood continued to be a problem that God's people had to actively combat. It wasn't enough to simply survive the flood. They had to continue fighting against the forces that sought to corrupt and destroy humanity. Modern implications and interpretations. Today, this ancient story continues to fascinate and puzzle readers. Some see it as purely mythological, an ancient way of explaining the existence of megalithic structures and the legends of giants found in cultures around the world. Others take it more literally and see evidence of ancient giants in archaeological discoveries, unexplained megalithic construction, and genetic anomalies. They argue that mainstream science and archaeology have suppressed evidence of giant human remains and advanced ancient civilizations. Still others interpret the story spiritually, seeing the giants as representing the forces of evil and corruption that God must continually combat in the world. From this perspective, the flood story is less about literal giants and more about God's commitment to preserving goodness and righteousness in creation. Lessons from the giants' destruction. Regardless of how literally one interprets these accounts, several important lessons emerge from the story of why God drowned the giants. The importance of genetic and spiritual purity. The story emphasizes that God cares deeply about maintaining the integrity of His creation. Whether interpreted physically or spiritually, this suggests that there are boundaries that shouldn't be crossed and consequences when they are. The danger of forbidden knowledge. The fallen angel's teaching of forbidden knowledge to humans serves as a warning about the dangers of pursuing power, knowledge, or abilities that we're not meant to have. Some knowledge can be corrupting rather than beneficial. God's commitment to justice. The complete destruction of the giants demonstrates that God will not allow evil to triumph indefinitely. No matter how powerful corruption becomes, God has the power to cleanse creation and start over. The value of righteousness. Noah's survival because of his righteousness shows that individual choices matter. Even when surrounded by corruption, it's possible to maintain integrity and find favor with God. The ongoing nature of the battle. The reappearance of giants after the flood suggests that the battle between good and evil is ongoing. Victory in one generation doesn't guarantee victory in the next. Each generation must choose to fight against corruption and evil. Conclusion. Understanding the necessity. The question of why God had to drown the giants finds its answer in understanding the magnitude of the threat they represented. These weren't just large people causing minor problems. They were supernatural beings whose very existence threatened to permanently corrupt humanity and derail God's plan for creation. The giants represented genetic contamination that could have spread to all humanity, making it impossible for a pure human Messiah to eventually be born. They brought violence and oppression on a scale that normal humans couldn't resist. They introduced forbidden knowledge that led people away from God and toward occult practices. Most fundamentally, they represented a successful rebellion against heaven that challenged God's authority over creation. In this context, the flood wasn't an overreaction. It was a necessary surgical strike to remove a cancer that threatened to destroy everything good in creation. Like a surgeon removing diseased tissue to save the patient's life, God removed the corruption to save humanity and preserve His plan for redemption. The story serves as a powerful reminder that evil, no matter how powerful it becomes, cannot ultimately triumph over good. It also warns us about the dangers of crossing boundaries that God has established, and the importance of maintaining spiritual and moral purity in our own lives. Whether we interpret this story literally or metaphorically, its message remains relevant. God takes corruption seriously, righteousness matters, and sometimes drastic measures are necessary to preserve what is good and pure. The giants had to be drowned, not because God was cruel or capricious, but because their continued existence would have meant the end of humanity as God intended it to be. In understanding this ancient story, we gain insight not just into biblical history, but into the ongoing struggle between good and evil that continues in our world today. The giants may be gone, but the need for vigilance against corruption, whether physical, spiritual, or moral, remains as important now as it was in Noah's time.